The morning air felt sharp against Elena Reyes's face as she stood at the edge of Lake Tahoe, watching the early light paint the water silver. It was November 2005, and she had driven up from Sacramento with her husband Daniel and their two children, 12-year-old Marcus and 8-year-old Lucia, for what was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway before the holiday rush. The cabin they'd rented sat tucked among the pines on the north shore, and Elena remembered thinking how peaceful it all seemed, how far removed from their hectic lives, managing a family restaurant in the city. Daniel had been excited about this trip for weeks. He'd grown up spending summers near Tahoe, back when his parents were still alive, and he wanted to share those memories with their children. On that Friday afternoon, after they'd unpacked and the kids had explored the cabin, Daniel suggested they take a drive around the lake before dinner. "Just to see the sights," he'd said, his eyes bright with anticipation. Elena had hesitated. The weather forecast mentioned possible snow, but the sky looked clear enough, and she didn't want to dampen his enthusiasm. Now, as Elena stood at this same spot 20 years later, her breath forming clouds in the cold morning air, she wondered for the 1,000th time what had happened during that drive. They'd never made it to dinner. They'd never come back at all. Before we continue with Elena's story, I'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything as we share these important stories together. The search had begun within hours of their disappearance. When the family hadn't returned to the cabin by 9 that evening, the property manager had called the authorities. Elena's sister, who'd expected a check-in call that night, had started calling hospitals. By midnight, the Placer County Sheriff's Office had launched a full search operation, though the snow that had started falling around dusk complicated everything. By morning, 6 inches covered the ground, and the roads around the lake had become treacherous. Detective Robert Hayes, who'd led the initial investigation, had interviewed dozens of people. Gas station attendants, restaurant staff, other tourists, anyone who might have seen the Reyes family that Friday. A clerk at a convenience store in Kings Beach remembered selling Daniel a bag of chips and some hot chocolate around 4 in the afternoon. That was the last confirmed sighting. Their silver Honda Pilot, license plate 4XBR829, had simply vanished, as if the mountain had swallowed it whole. Eleanor's parents had flown in from Texas, their faces etched with a grief that seemed to age them overnight. Her father, a retired police officer himself, had driven every accessible road around the lake, sometimes twice a day, convinced his eyes might catch something the official search had missed. Her mother had stayed at the cabin, keeping vigil, praying in Spanish, lighting candles that flickered through the long winter nights. The community response had been overwhelming. Volunteers from Sacramento, from Reno, from as far as San Francisco had arrived to help search. They'd walked the forests in organized lines, called out names until their voices went hoarse, distributed flyers with 4 smiling faces that soon became familiar to everyone in the region. Local news stations had covered the story extensively those first few weeks, and the footage still existed somewhere online. Elena couldn't bring herself to watch it anymore. The hope in her younger self's eyes, the way she'd pleaded into the cameras for anyone with information to come forward, seemed to belong to a different person entirely. As months passed and winter gave way to spring, the searches became less frequent, the news coverage sporadic. Detective Hayes had remained committed, following up on every tip that came in, but most led nowhere. There'd been reported sightings in Oregon, in Nevada, even as far south as Arizona, none credible. Some people suggested the family had chosen to disappear, to start over somewhere new, but anyone who'd known Daniel and Elena understood how absurd that was. They'd been happy. They'd had plans. Marcus had been preparing for his bar mitzvah. Elena had converted when they married, and Lucia had just started taking piano lessons she loved. The theories multiplied in the absence of facts. Foul play, though there was no evidence of it. An accident on one of the remote forest roads, confusion in the snowstorm, leading them far off course. Elena had heard them all, had turned each possibility over in her mind until she thought she might break from the weight of not knowing. The uncertainty was its own kind of torture, not quite grief, because grief implied an ending, but not hope either, because hope required something to hold on to. Her marriage to her second husband, Tom, had been good, stable. He'd been patient with her need to visit Tahoe every year on the anniversary, understood when she couldn't bring herself to celebrate Thanksgiving the way other families did. They'd had a daughter together, Sophia, who was now 15 and asking questions about the half-siblings she'd never met. Elena tried to answer honestly, but how did you explain a void that had shaped your entire adult life to someone who'd never experienced it? The years had changed her in ways both visible and not. The lines around her eyes had deepened, and threads of silver wove through her dark hair. She'd sold the restaurant, couldn't bear to work there without Daniel, and had eventually trained as a grief counselor, finding purpose in helping others navigate losses that at least had definition, finality. She'd learned to function, to build a new life, but the missing piece never stopped aching. Detective Hayes had retired in 2018, but he'd stayed in touch, calling every few months just to check in. "I never stopped thinking about your case," he'd told her at his retirement party. "Some cases just stay with you, you know. I always hoped I'd find them for you before I hung up my badge." Eleanor had thanked him, had meant it, though by then she'd long since stopped expecting answers. The phone call had come on a Tuesday in October 2024, nearly 19 years after that November weekend. Elena had been at work, sitting across from a client who'd lost her son to a hiking accident, when her phone vibrated. She'd ignored it. She never took calls during sessions, but it had buzzed again immediately, and then again. When the session ended and she checked her messages, she'd seen 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize and 2 from Detective Hayes' old cell phone. Her hands had trembled as she dialed him back. "Elena, I need you to sit down," Hayes had said, his voice thick with emotion. "They found something." A graduate student was using updated satellite imagery for a geography project, studying how the lake's shoreline has changed over the years. The imaging technology has gotten so much more sophisticated. It can penetrate water now, show things that were impossible to see before. "Elena, they found your car." The world had tilted. Elena had gripped the edge of her desk, her breath coming in short gasps. "Where?" she'd managed to ask. "About 40 feet offshore near Emerald Bay." "It's in deep water, maybe 100 feet down." The student noticed what looked like a vehicle and reported it. "The sheriff's department sent divers down yesterday." "Elena, it's them. The license plate matches. They're bringing it up tomorrow." The recovery operation had taken 2 days. Eleanor had stood on the shore with Tom beside her, watching the crane and the dive teams, the whole scene cordoned off and swarming with officials. When the Honda finally broke the surface, water streaming from its windows, crusted with lake sediment and algae, she'd felt her knees buckle. Tom had caught her, held her upright as they watched her past emerge from the depths. The medical examiner had confirmed what Elena already knew in her heart. Daniel had been in the driver's seat, Elena's sister later told her gently, sparing her some details while providing others she needed to know. Marcus and Lucia had been in the back. The car had gone through a guardrail that had been old and corroded even back in 2005, one that had since been replaced. In the snowstorm, with visibility nearly zero, Daniel likely hadn't seen the curve until too late. The car had plunged through, crashed into the freezing water, and sunk quickly. Death would have come fast, they assured her. The cold water would have made them lose consciousness within minutes. They'd been there all along. While she'd searched, while she'd grieved without resolution, while she'd built a new life and tried to move forward, They'd been resting in the depths of the lake, just miles from where she'd stood so many times, calling their names into the wind. The funeral, finally held in December 2024, had been both heartbreaking and cathartic. Elena's parents, now in their 80s, had wept as they'd finally laid their grandchildren to rest. Friends from 2 decades ago had returned, their own children now grown. The rabbi who'd been preparing Marcus for his bar mitzvah, now retired, had spoken about interrupted journeys and the Jewish concept of hakarat hatov, recognizing the good. Marcus would have been 32 now, Lucia 28. Elena let herself imagine just for a moment who they might have become. The news coverage this time was different, less about mysterious disappearance and more about closure found through technology. The graduate student, a young woman named Cara Lynn from UC Davis, had attended the funeral, apologizing for her intrusion into Elena's grief. Elena had hugged her, thanked her, told her she'd given a gift beyond measure, the gift of knowing. In the months since, Elena had been returning to therapy herself, processing a grief that had fundamentally shifted. Dr. Patel, her therapist, had explained that this was a new kind of loss. The one she'd carried for 19 years was being replaced by one with boundaries, with facts, with the terrible but necessary finality of death confirmed. "You get to grieve properly now," she'd said. "That's not nothing." Standing at the lake on this October morning in 2025, Eleanor held a small bag of Marcus's favorite candies and Lucia's beloved toy rabbit, recovered from the car and painstakingly cleaned by the sheriff's department. She'd come alone this time, needing the solitude. The water was calm, reflecting the mountains and the impossibly blue sky. A pair of kayakers paddled by in the distance, their laughter carrying across the water, and Elena found she didn't resent their joy. Life continued. It always did. She thought about Daniel's excitement for this trip, his desire to share his memories. In a way, he'd given their children something eternal. They'd become part of this place, part of its depths and mysteries. The lake had held them gently, had kept them together. That was something. Elena knelt and placed her hand against the cold water. "I found you," she whispered. "I never stopped looking, and I finally found you." Behind her, footsteps approached. She turned to see Tom, who'd given her space but had clearly followed at a distance, making sure she wasn't truly alone. Sophia was with him, and when Elena saw her daughter's face, so full of love and concern, she realized that this too was part of her story. Not just the loss, but what had grown around it. Not replacement, but continuation. "Mum," Sophia asked softly, "are you okay?" Eleanor stood, brushing dirt from her knees, and pulled her daughter into an embrace. "I am," she said, and meant it. "I really am." They stood together for a long time, the three of them, looking out at the water where a family had been lost and, eventually, found. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air, burning off the last wisps of mist. A breeze rustled through the pines, carrying the scent of sap and earth and the promise of winter's approach. Elena thought about Detective Hayes, who'd never given up, about the volunteer searchers who donated their time and hope, about Caroline and her geography project that had changed everything, about the ways technology could reach into the past and pull truth into the light. "Tell me about them," Sophia said. "About Marcus and Lucia. I want to know everything." So Eleanor did. She told stories about Marcus's obsession with dinosaurs when he was little, how he'd memorized every species and could discourse on them for hours. She talked about Lucia's dramatic nature, how she'd put on elaborate shows in their living room, using bed sheets as curtains and demanding tickets for entry. She described Daniel's terrible jokes, his gift for making anyone feel welcome at their restaurant. the way he danced with her in the kitchen when he thought no one was watching. She spoke of ordinary moments elevated by their absence, the way Marcus would bite his lower lip when concentrating on homework, Lucia's habit of humming while she colored, Daniel's morning ritual of reading the paper with his coffee, commenting aloud even when no one was listening. These details, preserved in memory for 19 years, felt sacred now, like prayers offered to the wind. Other families arrived at various spots along the shore as the morning progressed, spreading blankets, launching small boats. Life at Lake Tahoe continued as it always had, indifferent to individual tragedies, beautiful in its constancy. Elena watched a father teaching his young son to skip stones, the boy's concentration absolute, the father's patience endless. She felt the pang of what Daniel had missed, would always miss, but also a strange gratitude that these moments existed at all, that somewhere fathers were teaching sons, and mothers were watching daughters, and families were simply being together. "They would have loved you," Elena told Sophia. "They would have loved who you are." Sophia leaned into her mother's shoulder. "I think I would have been a pretty good big sister," she said quietly. "The best," Elena agreed. Before leaving, Elena pulled out her phone and opened the mapping app, zooming in on Emerald Bay. The technology that had found her family was available to anyone now, accessible with a few taps on a screen. She thought about all the other families still searching, still hoping, and she hoped for them that answers would come. Not everyone got closure. She understood that now. But for those who did, the relief was profound, even wrapped as it was in renewed sorrow. Tom drove them back toward Sacramento, Sophia dozing in the back seat, and Elena watched the mountains recede in the side mirror. She'd return to Tahoe again, she always did, but the pull would be different now. Not the desperate searching, not the annual vigil hoping for a miracle, but something gentler, a remembering, a honoring, a peace. Her phone buzzed with a text from Detective Hayes. "Thinking of you today. Hope you're doing okay." "I am," Elena typed back. "Thank you for never giving up." "But that's what we do for the people we serve," he replied. "I'm glad you have your answers, Elena. I'm glad we could bring them home." Home. Such a complicated word for what had happened. But perhaps that was it in the end. After 19 years in the depths, they'd come home, and Elena, after 19 years of suspended grief, could finally let herself say goodbye properly, could finally allow herself to heal in a way that had been impossible when the story had no ending. As they merged onto the highway, Elena closed her eyes and let the motion of the car lull her towards something like rest. In her mind, she saw her family as they'd been that last morning. Marcus complaining about the early hour, Lucia bouncing with excitement, Daniel loading the car with their weekend bags, all of them together and whole. That image was real. It had happened. Nothing could take it away. The lake had kept its secrets for nearly 2 decades, but ultimately it had yielded them. Sometimes answers came too late for justice, too late for rescue, too late for anything but the knowledge itself. But knowledge mattered. Truth mattered. Knowing that you'd been loved, that you'd been searched for, that someone had never stopped hoping, that mattered too. Elena opened her eyes as they passed a sign for Auburn, only 40 minutes from home now. She thought about the grief counseling session she had scheduled for tomorrow, about the dinner she'd promised to make for Tom and Sophia tonight, about the ordinary rhythms of a life that continued despite everything. Survival wasn't betrayal. Moving forward wasn't forgetting. She understood that now in a way she hadn't before. The technology that had found her family, satellite imagery, sophisticated enough to penetrate water and reveal what had been hidden, seemed almost miraculous. But Elena knew it was just science, progress, the steady march of human innovation. Still, she chose to see it as something else too. as the universe's way of saying that some things needed to be found, that some families deserved their peace, even if it came decades late. As they pulled into their driveway, Sophia stirred awake. "We're home," she murmured. "Yes," Elena said, looking at her daughter, at Tom, at the house they'd built together. "We are." And for the first time in 19 years, when Elena said those words, they felt completely true. The weeks following that October visit to the lake brought an unexpected media attention Elena hadn't anticipated. The story had caught fire online. Something about the intersection of old tragedy and new technology resonated with people. News outlets from across the country requested interviews. A producer from a streaming documentary series called 3 Times. Elena's inbox filled with messages from strangers, offering condolences, sharing their own stories of loss, asking if she'd be willing to speak publicly about her experience. At first, she'd declined everything. The grief was still too raw, too private. But Dr. Patel had encouraged her to consider it carefully. "Sometimes telling your story helps others," she'd said during their session. "And sometimes it helps you process what you've been through. There's no wrong choice here, Eleanor. Just what feels right for you." It was a call from a woman named Patricia Holbrook that changed Elena's mind. Patricia's husband and teenage daughter had vanished during a camping trip in Yosemite in 2011. 14 years of searching, of wondering, of that same suspended grief Elena knew so well. "I saw your story on the news," Patricia had said, her voice breaking, "and I thought, maybe this technology could help other families too. Maybe someone needs to advocate for using it more widely. Would you consider it?" Elena had thought about Detective Hayes, about the volunteer searchers, about Cara Lynn, who'd simply been doing her schoolwork when she'd stumbled upon a family's fate. She'd thought about all the other Patricias out there, living in that terrible limbo. 3 days later, she'd called the producer back. The documentary filming began in January 2025. The crew was respectful, professional, giving Elena control over what she shared and what remained private. They interviewed Detective Hayes, now 73, but still sharp as ever. They spoke with the dive team that had recovered the vehicle. They featured Cara Lynn, who explained the technology in terms anyone could understand, how satellite and aerial imaging had advanced exponentially, how machine learning algorithms could now identify submerged objects, how what had once required expensive specialized equipment was becoming accessible to researchers and law enforcement. "There are thousands of missing persons cases in this country," Cara explained to the camera, "and many of them might be solvable if we applied these tools systematically. Elena's family was found almost by accident, but it doesn't have to be that way. We could be proactive." The documentary, titled Beneath the Surface, Technology and the Search for Missing Families, premiered in March 2025. Elena watched it with Tom and Sophia, tissues nearby, but also with a sense of purpose she hadn't expected. The filmmakers had balanced the personal tragedy with the larger implications beautifully. They'd featured 4 other families still searching, including Patricia's, and ended with information about advocacy organizations working to make advanced search technology more widely available. Within a week of the premiere, Patricia called again. "They're sending a team to Yosemite," she said, sobbing. "The documentary put pressure on the Park Service. They're going to do a comprehensive scan of the areas my family was last seen. Elena, this is because of you, because you were willing to share your story." Elena felt the weight of that responsibility and the strange gift of it. Her family's tragedy might prevent other families from enduring 19 years of uncertainty. That didn't erase the pain, didn't bring Daniel and Marcus and Lucia back, but it gave their loss a meaning beyond itself. The response to the documentary was significant. a coalition of technology companies and non-profit organizations announced a partnership to create a national database using satellite imagery to search for missing persons in remote areas. Law enforcement agencies in 12 states requested training on the new search protocols. And most importantly to Elena, families started getting answers. By May 2025, Patricia's husband and daughter had been found. Their vehicle had gone off a steep embankment in an area searchers had covered on foot, but where the wreckage had been obscured by dense vegetation. In June, a family of 3 missing since 2008 in Montana was located in a ravine. In July, 2 hikers missing for 6 years in Colorado. Each discovery brought its own grief, but also that crucial closure, that ability to finally lay loved ones to rest properly. Elena started receiving letters, handwritten ones, carefully composed emails, even packages containing photos and mementos from grateful families. A woman in Oregon thanked her for giving her the strength to advocate for renewed searches for her brother. A man in Wyoming credited the documentary with inspiring local volunteers to form a search and recovery team using the new technology. Each letter represented a life touched, a family helped, a small light in the darkness of uncertainty. But not everything was positive. The attention also brought out people who meant well but said hurtful things. "At least you know now," someone commented online, as if knowledge alone could erase 19 years of torment. Others suggested she should sue someone, the county for the faulty guardrail, the state for inadequate road maintenance. A few accused her of profiting from tragedy when she accepted a modest speaking fee to address a conference on missing persons cases. Tom helped her navigate these moments, reminding her that she didn't owe anyone an explanation for how she grieved or healed. Sophia, wise beyond her 15 years, pointed out that the critics were usually people who'd never experienced profound loss. "It's easy to judge when you don't understand," she said. "You're helping people, Mom. That's what matters." In August, Elena was invited to speak at a symposium organized by the National Association of Missing Persons Organizations. Standing before an audience of law enforcement officials, victim advocates, and other families of missing persons, she felt a nervousness she hadn't anticipated. She'd told her story to cameras, to journalists, but this felt different. These were people who understood, who lived in the same shadow she'd inhabited for so long. "I'm not an expert," she began, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "I'm not a technology specialist or a law enforcement professional. I'm just someone who spent 19 years not knowing what happened to the people I loved most in the world. And I'm here to tell you that the not knowing, that's its own special kind of hell." She talked about the theories she'd constructed and deconstructed, the false hope of unverified sightings, the guilt that came with moving forward into a new life, while part of her remained frozen in 2005. She described the moment she'd learned they'd been found and how that knowledge had hurt and healed simultaneously. "Technology gave me something I thought I'd never have. Answers," she continued. "But more than that, it gave me permission to grieve properly. It gave me an ending to a story that had been suspended for nearly 2 decades. And if sharing my experience can help even one other family get that same gift, then something meaningful has come from our loss." The standing ovation surprised her. Afterward, people lined up to speak with her, to share their own stories, to ask advice about navigating their searches. A detective from Minnesota asked about her experience with Hayes and what had made his approach so effective. A mother from Tennessee, whose son had vanished 5 years earlier, simply hugged her and whispered, "Thank you for giving me hope." Patricia Holbrook was there too. The 2 women embraced like old friends, though they'd met in person only once before. "We're starting a foundation," Patricia said, "to fund search operations using this technology for families who can't afford it otherwise. Would you consider joining our board?" Elena hadn't expected that. Her life was already full, her counseling practice, her family, the speaking engagement she'd committed to. But looking at Patricia's face, thinking about all the families still searching, she found herself nodding. "Yes," she said, "I'd be honored." The foundation, which they named the Daniel Marcus Lucia Fund after Elena's family, launched in September 2025. The initial funding came from donations inspired by the documentary, supplemented by grants from technology companies eager to support the practical application of their innovations. Their mission was simple: to provide advanced search technology and expertise to families of missing persons who lacked the resources to access these tools on their own. Their first case was a grandfather and grandson who disappeared during a fishing trip in Idaho in 2019. Within 3 weeks of beginning the search, using satellite imagery and sonar mapping, they'd located the pair's boat in a remote section of reservoir, capsized and submerged. The family's gratitude was profound, but so was their pain, a reminder that finding answers didn't erase loss. "That's the hardest part of this work," Elena told Tom one evening as they sat on their back porch. "Every family we help is also a family we're delivering devastating news to. We're confirming their worst fears." "But you're also ending their uncertainty," Tom reminded her. "You know better than anyone how valuable that is." He was right. Elena did know. She knew it in the way she could now visit Tahoe without that frantic, desperate energy she'd carried for years. She knew it in the way she could tell stories about Daniel and the kids without feeling like she was betraying them by living her own life. She knew it in the way she could sleep through the night without jolting awake from dreams where she was still searching, still calling their names into an empty forest. By October 2025, exactly 1 year after that phone call from Detective Hayes, the Foundation had helped locate 7 missing persons. Not all were deceased. In one remarkable case, an elderly woman with dementia who'd wandered from a care facility in rural Nevada was spotted on satellite imagery, still alive, sheltered in an abandoned building. But most discoveries were like Elena's own. Tragic confirmations, but confirmations nonetheless. The Foundation's work attracted more media attention, more donations, more volunteers. Retired detectives offered their expertise. Technology companies provided software and training at reduced costs. Dive teams and search and rescue organizations partnered with them. What had started as one woman's tragedy and another woman's advocacy had become a movement. Elena found herself thinking often about the randomness of how her family had been found. If Cara Lynn had chosen a different location for her geography project, if the satellite imagery hadn't been updated just then, if the angle of the sun hitting the water had been different, they might still be undiscovered. That randomness bothered her. Too many families' fates depended on chance, on someone happening to look in the right place at the right time with the right tools. "We need to be more systematic," she told the Foundation's board during their November meeting. "We should prioritize searches based on factors like water depth, terrain accessibility, length of time missing. We need protocols, not just good intentions." They hired a data analyst to help develop those protocols. They consulted with forensic anthropologists, park rangers, and accident reconstruction specialists. Slowly, they built a framework for how to effectively deploy advanced search technology in missing persons cases. Other organizations started adopting their methods. Law enforcement agencies requested their assistance. Families around the country began reaching out. Elena's counseling practice became focused almost entirely on families dealing with ambiguous loss, those whose loved ones were missing without confirmation of death. She understood their experience in a way few therapists could. She could sit with their contradiction of needing to hope while preparing for the worst. She could validate the guilt they felt about moving forward. She could bear witness to their pain without trying to fix it prematurely. One client, a man named James, whose wife had disappeared during a solo hike in 2017, asked her during a session, "Does it get easier, even knowing?" Elena considered the question carefully. "It gets different," she said finally. "The not knowing is its own torture. But knowing doesn't erase the loss, it just changes its shape. You stop waiting for them to walk through the door, and you start learning to live with their permanent absence. Neither is easy, but I can tell you that I sleep better now than I did for 19 years. I can tell you that I'm no longer haunted by what-ifs quite the same way. The grief is cleaner somehow, if that makes sense." James had nodded, tears streaming down his face. "It does," he said. "It makes perfect sense." As Thanksgiving approached, Eleanor found herself reflecting on gratitude in ways that felt paradoxical. She was grateful for answers, even though they confirmed her worst fears. She was grateful for the Foundation's work, even though it meant immersing herself in other families' tragedies. She was grateful for the life she'd built with Tom and Sophia, even though it existed only because her first life had been shattered. She learned that gratitude and grief could coexist, that you could mourn what was lost while appreciating what remained. On Thanksgiving Day, she lit candles for Daniel, Marcus, and Lucia, a tradition she'd maintained for 20 years. But this year, the ritual felt less like an attempt to keep them alive through remembrance and more like a simple honoring of who they'd been and what they'd meant to her. Sophia helped her set the table, placing framed photos of her half-siblings at empty chairs, a gesture Elena found both heartbreaking and healing. "I want them to be part of this," Sophia explained. "They're family, even though I never got to meet them." Over dinner, Elena shared more stories. Funny ones this time, like when Marcus had tried to cook breakfast in bed for Mother's Day and had nearly set the kitchen curtains on fire, or when Lucia had decided to give herself a haircut the day before school pictures. Tom contributed stories about his late father, keeping his memory alive for Sophia. They laughed and cried and gave thanks for the people they'd loved and the ways those people had shaped who they'd become. Later that evening, Patricia called with news. They'd received a substantial grant that would allow the Foundation to expand operations into 5 more states. "We're making a difference, Elena," she said. "A real, tangible difference, and it started with you being brave enough to share your story." Elena thought about bravery. She'd never felt particularly courageous, just desperate, then determined, then driven by a need to make meaning from senseless loss. But maybe that was what bravery looked like in real life. Not grand gestures, but the decision to keep going, to help others, to transform personal tragedy into communal purpose. As December arrived and the anniversary of her family's funeral approached, Elena prepared for what she knew would be an emotional milestone, but she also prepared for the Foundation's year-end fundraising campaign, for the 3 new cases they'd just taken on, for the speech she'd agreed to give at a law enforcement conference in January. Her life had become intertwined with the work of finding the missing, of supporting those who searched, of advocating for better tools and resources. She visited the cemetery where Daniel, Marcus, and Lucia were buried, bringing flowers and standing in the cold for a long time. "I hope you're proud of what's come from this," she told them. "I hope it matters that your story has helped others. I hope you know you're still loved, still remembered, still part of everything I do." The wind rustled through the bare trees, and Elena allowed herself to imagine it was their response. Not words, just presence. Just the knowledge that love didn't end with death, that family existed beyond physical boundaries, that the bonds formed in life echoed forward through time even when the people themselves were gone. That night, Elena sat down to write the Foundation's annual report. She documented the searches they'd conducted, the families they'd helped, the partnerships they'd formed, but she also wrote about the intangibles, the hope restored, the closure achieved, the permission granted to grieve properly. She wrote about what it meant to transform loss into purpose, pain into advocacy, personal tragedy into communal healing. As she finished the report and sent it to the board, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of completion. Not an ending, because the work would continue, but a recognition that she'd come through something and emerged on the other side, changed, but whole. 20 years after that November weekend in 2005, she'd finally found a way to honor her lost family while fully inhabiting her present one. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet suburban street. Christmas lights were beginning to appear on houses, families preparing for the holidays, life continuing in its ordinary, extraordinary way. Somewhere out there, other families were searching, wondering, hoping. And now, because of the technology that had found her family and the foundation they'd built from that discovery, some of those families would get the answers they desperately needed. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to balance the scales or undo the loss. But it was something, and sometimes, Elena had learned, something was all you could hope for, a way to move forward, a purpose greater than grief, a light to carry through the darkness for others who were still searching.